This is the Connected Baby podcast series, sponsored by you, the listener. If you'd like to help spread the message of the science of connection even further, then you can make a donation at connectedbaby.net/donate.
Welcome to the Connected Baby podcast, where we explore how people are putting the science of connection to use in their lives.
Hello there, and welcome to Connected Baby Weekly Podcasts with Dr. Suzanne Zeedyk and Gary Robinson. This is our weekly insight into the science of connection. And it's not just Suzanne and I today. We've been joined on the phone by John Carnochan, who was a DCI in Strathclyde Police for over 30 years and the previous co-director of the Scottish Violence Reduction Unit. Hello, John.
Hello, how are you?
We're both very good, I think. If I could speak for us both, I think we're both very good.
Brilliant to have you here, John. Thanks.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
Good. John, if you could start off by telling us, how does a high-profile police officer such as yourself become linked with an organisation such as Connected Baby? How did it come about?
Oh, well, an easy one. Yeah. Well, I think as you had said at the start, I had been a police officer for about 30 years. Well, I was for 39 years, but around the 30-year mark, I started to work with Karen McCluskey, who's the current director, and she was the co-founder with me of the Violence Reduction Unit in Strathclyde Police, trying to find a homicide reduction strategy. We were tasked with producing a homicide reduction strategy. And when we started to look at it, we realised very quickly, probably Karen before me, that we couldn't really do a homicide reduction strategy on its own, because most of our homicides, and there were a lot of homicides back in 2004, the homicides themselves were actually a happenstance. The violence was deliberate, but the outcome was often a happenstance. So I was reflecting on the notion that I'd locked up lots and lots of young men during my service for murder, and most of them would have some version of a phrase that said, "I didn't mean to kill him," and the truth of the matter is, they didn't. They would carry a knife and they would use a knife, usually because that's what everyone else did. And so they were conforming to what was around them, which was just a human trait. And so they started to do that. And so we realised that if we wanted to actually bring about sustainable reductions in homicides, we had to look at violence. And so we started to look at violence in all its forms, from bullying through to suicide and everything in between. And when we started then to look at that, not as a crime issue, that's why we were called the Violence Reduction Unit and not the Violent Crime Reduction Unit. We realised very quickly that if we applied a preventative model to that, like a public health model, we could start to think much clearly about how we might make Scotland safer, how we might reduce violence. And part of that model took us to primary prevention, which was about early years. And when we started doing this, we were really very fortunate in that the Chief Constable was Sir Willie Ray, who was very thoughtful, very inclusive, very bright, and he allowed Karen and I to actually connect or speak to whoever we wanted to explore this. There was no set rule, there was no time scale. At the time we used to joke, we didn't have a business plan, all we had was a compass. We wanted to just make Scotland safer, and that was the way we went. And so we came across people one was Alan Sinclair, who was an economist, and he had been working out why it was that the skills that were lacking in young people when employers reported them back were skills like problem solving and communication. They were people skills. They were non-cognitive skills. And when we started to think more about that, we found the work of James Heckman, who spoke about early years and the value of early years, and then realised very quickly that the young men we were dealing with didn't learn how to be violent. And in fact, they learned how not to be violent. They learned that in those early years, they learned better to communicate, to negotiate, to compromise. They learned to problem solve. They learned empathy, and so that made violence no longer an option for them. They had other ways of dealing with the challenges life was throwing at them.
John, Sorry, John. Sorry, may I interrupt for just a second? I've got a question I don't want to lose sight of here. You talked about having a very understanding Chief Constable, which was great, but I'm sure that there was a level of command between you and the Chief Constable where there was a level of scepticism about this. How did you cope with that?
Oh yeah, absolutely there was, and not just from policing. There was a level of scepticism through all every agency normally we bumped into, because there was very much, and it still is to a lesser degree. There's very much that silo mentality that we actually defined people and problems by the services that we deliver. So if you're a cop, you see an accused or a witness, or you see a crime. You don't see a child or a brother or a sister or an aunt or an uncle or a patient so there was very much lots of that. So first of all, what we had to do was we had to get ourselves in the moral high ground, and so we decided that we had to police as best we can. So we weren't saying that policing didn't have a role to play. What we were saying was that policing, even at its very best, would only have a limited impact. It could contain and manage the problem, it could stabilise the patient, whatever analogy you want to use, but it could not bring about sustainable reductions in violence simply by policing. You couldn't do that. I mean, if criminal justice worked to do that, then America would be the safest place in the world, and it's not. So it was the understanding that there was many more things that impact on why people are violent.
And in fact, that's where John and I first came into contact, was because I heard about what he was doing in linking early years to violence, and I got irritated with the press who were making fun of them. And I wrote to say, good on you, keep at it, having no idea who the Violence Reduction Unit was. And then we showed up and had this wonderful meeting. Do you remember that, John?
I do indeed, yeah. And that was because at the time as well, Gary, I mean, the truth of the matter was I was sceptical. I mean, I'm an optimistic cynic. I mean, I was a detective for 30 years, usually investigating serious crimes, usually murder. I was pretty cynical about things. I mean, you had to, if you were telling me something, then you had to have some evidence to back it up. I wasn't naive about these things. And as it turned out, in the end, that's probably what acted in our favour too. Because when the press wrote things like, here is this police officer who wants to be in the delivery rooms when babies are born, and I thought, and that's when we started to question what we were thinking about. And when Suzanne then contacted us and wrote to the press and said, look, you're absolutely in the right area. So we started to explore that much more and gain more confidence when we learned more about the argument and the strength of argument and the strength and weight of evidence that was there about the early years, about attachment, about we started doing having some discussions with Harry Burns. Now, Sir Harry Burns, who was the chief medical officer, but at that time he was in the director of public health in Glasgow, and Harry was trying to figure out why people in the poorest areas of Glasgow took longer to recover from surgery, because Harry had been a surgeon, than people in the better off areas. Why was that? It wasn't simple enough to say it was diet or it was their house and where they... So he was thinking about that. And so together we started to explore the idea of why might that be? And what we came up with, Harry with the science, and then me and Karen converting the science into what we were doing every day, was that notion of alienation, that notion of disconnection, that when someone loses Antonovsky called it a sense of coherence. When you don't feel you belong, then it's very difficult. It becomes stressful for you. When you feel you've no control over your life and what happens to it, when you don't have the inner capacity to deal with life, when you're feckless. And lots of the young men that we were dealing with were just feckless. They weren't master criminals. They were young men who were involved in violence because it's all they knew. They didn't have the wherewithal to get them on a bus from some of the schemes into the city centre. They wouldn't know how to do that.
And it's really fascinating to realise that that's an issue of attachment. Most people don't think of that aggressive behaviour as issues of attachment, but that's exactly what John's describing.
Yeah, and so it was that notion that when these young guys were completely disconnected. So if we went into Pullman and we took the Young Offender Institute, and at that time, it had twice as many young men in it than it does today. That's a measure of success. But at that time, 70% of the young men who were there for non-sexual violent crime. They were violent young men. And if you took any 10 of those young men at random and asked them two questions, asked them if they had witnessed violence in their home when they were young, and they will all have put their hand up. Ask them if they had any positive male role models in their life, and none of them will put their hands up.
And when we realize that the evidence shows very clearly that when you have, all you have to do is witness violence. You don't even have to experience it. Of course, lots of children do experience violence, but studies like the ACE study, Adverse Childhood Experiences study, which Harry Burns talks about and lots of other people talk about, now very classic, tells us that if you witness violence, it changes your brain. It changes the way you handle emotions. People don't realize how much these experiences get wrapped into children's bodies physiologically.
And John, you had some very, very tangible results. I believe that gang violence in Glasgow decreased by about 50%. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, amongst the group we were working with, it was closer to 60. I mean, admissions to hospital for knife crime in Glasgow are down 34%. Admissions to hospital for violence is down 17%. Gang fines is the exception rather than the norm. Violence is at a 40-year low. Murders we've less than half the number of murders now than we had in 2004 when we started.
That's in 10 years. I mean, if we just think about how impressive that is, that's a gigantic drop in terms of the positive impact on lives. You're saving people. Yeah. You're not creating the distress for people's lives, because lots of other people are affected by murder than just the person who's died. That's an obvious statement, but we don't think about that. And if we think about the money that's saved, that's in 10 years, and that's police thinking about connection and babies, which sounds bizarre to lots of people. And I love it because it means people are getting connection when they really come to understand this impact.
It takes me on to a couple of quotes I've got in front of me here from you, John. And I'm paraphrasing here, but tell me, is it true you said that you'd rather have 1,000 more health visitors than 1,000 more police officers?
Yes, I did. It was I was being interviewed before the Scottish elections, not the last one, the ones before. And in fact, this morning I raised the issue again of 1,000 extra cops. I was asked about the idea of 1,000 extra police officers. Did I think it was a good idea? And I said, yeah, I think it's a really good idea. And then I followed it up and qualified it by saying, but what would be a clever idea would be 1,000 extra health visitors. That would be smart. And the reporter, who was David Leask, who's the chief reporter of the Herald, he phoned me about an hour after he left the office and to confirm the quote, because he said, I'm not sure you actually said this, it's probably my shorthand. I said, no, I actually said that.
And so part of the point of Connected Baby is to help nurture that kind of alternative thinking. It's the fact that came from a cop that is surprising to people. And if a cop can think in terms of the power of health visitors, then other people can think what are kind of radical ideas in their field, and it gets us all thinking differently and making a difference for the world.
The other quote I've got here, John, which tickled me, I have to say, but probably not that of maybe some of your colleagues in the finance department. The biggest gangs aren't on the streets, but in budgeting committees.
Yeah, well, I said, I actually, that's a truncated version. I also said the biggest gangs that are not on the streets, but they include health, social work, police, education, third sector, budget controllers, because they're more corrosive, they're more territorial, they defend their turf, and their value frames are all different. They have a different language. The same way as the guys on the street have a different language. They have it's exactly the same thing. And it's the same behaviours. And it was about challenging that. It was trying to say to people that violence and community safety, for instance, is a shared agenda. It's not an issue just for the police. The same way as education is not an issue for classrooms, just for classrooms alone. I mean, if you think about it, children go to school when they're 5, which is far too early, but they go to school when they're 5, and they'll leave when they're 15 or 16. They'll go for, I think it's 190 days a year for 6 hours a day. Now tell me how that is going to have a bigger impact on them than the remaining time that they spend with their family, in home, with adults around them and their community and their neighbours. For goodness sake. So part of the challenge and part of that was to challenge the notion that, and it's probably why it's so difficult. It's probably why people are stuck with it, because we now seem to value things like, we talk about knowledge and we talk about best practice, and we think that complex things and complex challenges need complex solutions, and they don't. And I think one of the things is, if we actually went with the evidence and said, look, the most important 4 years of a child's life are up to age 3. So anything that we can do to support parents to be as good as they can be, so that those early years for those children are fulfilling, enriching,
and by good,
and safe.
And that's exactly, by good, what we mean is parents who can produce feelings of safety, parents who can remain calm in the supermarket, which is one of the things we talked about in the last podcast, parents who can listen to their child's feelings. That's what you mean by good parents, John.
Yes.
John, just repeat that quote for somebody who is listening now, because my ears pricked up. The quote that you said at the start of that paragraph, sentence, whatever you want to call it.
The most important 4 years of a child's life are up to age 3. So what happens to mum? You can't protect babies, from a let's say a violence perspective or domestic abuse perspective. You can't protect babies unless you protect their mums. And if we don't fix violence against women, we will never fix violence. That's something that's fundamental. That makes it hugely difficult to make headway on it. That's why Police Scotland have been focusing on domestic violence. It has such a huge impact.
And it's really powerful to realize that what happens for a baby in the womb is already shaping their brains. You can have a baby who's already born stressed, which is what John's trying to say.
Yeah.
John, I've got 2 more questions for you before we wrap up. You left the Scottish Violence Reduction Unit last year, I believe, and you've set up a website called Responding Differently. Tell me a little bit about it.
Well, Responding Differently was just trying to say what it says in the tin. It was about saying, look, if we really do believe in prevention, that prevention is the only cure, and it is, not just to violence. It's a whole range of things. So if we improve the way people think about themselves and look after themselves, if we allow children to grow up in a healthy environment where they can make good decisions about themselves and they can acquire those non-cognitive skills that we identified early on were absent in lots of these guys, then not only will they unlikely to be involved in violence, but they're likely to make good decisions about what they eat and their diet and about taking drugs and about taking alcohol. They're more likely to enjoy healthy relationships with their families and their friends and those close to them. They're more likely to have good relationships with their own children. Because the other thing that we always try to remind people of is that if you go into Berlini, most men in Berlini will be dads. Most young men in Poland will be dads. And if you ask them what they want for their children, they will tell you they don't want the same as what they have themselves. And that's a teachable moment. That's something that so rather than teaching guys how to work a wood lathe or macrame when they're in Poland or whatever it is they do, you'd be much better saying, we're going to help you understand better what it is to be a dad, understand about relationships, how to play with your children, how to speak to your children.
And so one of the things that Connected Baby will be able to do in future podcasts is bring together examples of, for instance, Dad's Rock is working with men in prison, trying to help think about how do we apply this. So one of the things we'll be able to do in the podcast is interview all the people that John has talked about to see how people are applying this information.
John, one final question, and I'm sure that by the sound of things, you're going to be a very regular guest on this feature. Just one thing. that you think somebody listening to this has to take away about understanding connection? It's a massive subject. I'm learning every week. But from your point of view, what thought are you going to leave somebody with right now?
Well, I think what I'd want to say is that, and what I want people to remember and have at the front of their mind, no matter who they are, is to think, first of all, as a human, before you start thinking as a social worker or a police officer or whatever. That first and foremost, we're humans. And if we think ourselves about being connected or disconnected, and then start to think about how we deal with, professionally, how we deal with it with other things. Because it's about that. It's about relationships. And the relationships are that absolute fundamental human relationship between parents and babies and children. And it extends to the strangers in the street. That's the difference. It's about humanity. It's no longer, and it's the same. I think it's part of that reason why we perhaps don't get things done, because we have so many professionals, whether they're social work or health or education or police, who are so trained and have so many technical skills. They're wonderful at things. But they often forget that at the end of the day, what they are sons and daughters. Everyone is a son or a daughter, everybody. And if we started with that baseline, then it would be much, much easier to make the right decisions about things. Not just in terms of what we do as individuals, but what policy might be in government. Yeah. And whilst they try to do it, it often gets lost a little bit. So what I would say to people is, and what I do say is, look, let's start from that. Let's start from the basis that we're human. So let's talk about empathy and let's talk about compassion and let's talk about care and not be afraid to do that. Because we talk about those things, they don't appear in our job descriptions, but they should. The job descriptions will be full of technical stuff, and we'll have lovely diplomas and degrees and a whole range of things which are important, but they shouldn't be valued above compassion. They shouldn't be valued above kindness. They shouldn't be valued above care. They shouldn't be valued above empathy. They add to it.
And John,
and that's what I would remind people of.
What I love is that you are a cop who is willing to talk about compassion and kindness and empathy as a way of tackling the world's problems. I am so grateful you do that. And I am so grateful that you have given your time today to help get this message out there.
Great. Happy to do it. Great. We've got lots of work to do, but I suppose the positive thing is we do have, in Scotland, we do have Suzanne Zeedyk talking about connected babies. We do have Harry Burns talking about, about alienation and connection. We do have others speaking about these things. So, and what I've learned, in nearly 40 years in the police is, nobody starts off wanting to do things wrong, whether they're politicians, doesn't matter who they are. Nobody starts off when their baby's born saying, I'm going to make your life a misery. They don't. So let's start off from there, which is human, and say, let's have a go. It'll take us a while. We need to keep saying it, need to keep doing it, but we'll get there with it.
John Carnochan, Dr. Suzanne Zeedyk, thank you very much indeed.
Delighted.
Thank you.
This was a GRC production for Connected Baby.